When Donald Trump threatens war against Iran, there's no way of knowing whether he means to follow through. But for 2 weeks now, protests against the regime have been growing.
Tens of thousands of anti-government protesters filled the streets of Iran tonight as unrest there escalates.
And Trump's patience for the regime has been shrinking.
I tell the Iranian leaders, you better not start shooting because we'll start shooting too.
The president has shown he's unafraid to use military options if and when he deems necessary.
Trump's threat campaign began when he told the Iranian regime the U.S. is locked and loaded and ready to go. This was an ultimatum, one that Iran would seem to ignore by continuing to kill protesters.
Human rights activists say around 500 people have been killed since the protests erupted 2 weeks ago.
But they still apparently heard the message, threatening the U.S. and its allies back in the event of an attack. And just a couple of days later, Trump boosting protesters by way of a threat to the regime. Save the names of the killers and abusers. They will pay a big price. Help is on its way.
Airstrikes would be one of the many, many options that are on the table for the commander-in-chief.
Trump's stated motivation for threatening to attack Iran is basically whatever it takes to save lives. Stop the brutal crackdown on protesters who are furious with the cost of living. But I'll show you how there's likely much more to this than that, for the United States and even for Trump himself. If the US seems eager to intervene in Iran's affairs right now, it's at least partially because there's an opening to do so because of how weak Iran is right now. It has suffered a devastating series of cascading failures, militarily, economically, but let's start politically. You have to wonder how widespread these protests actually are, since we've seen other mass protests in recent years. Like, how much trouble is the regime in? It's hard to know because Iran is opaque. It's considered one of the most repressive media environments on the planet. At the time I record this, Iran is in its 7th day of an internet blackout imposed by the regime. And it was only a couple of days ago I was seeing headlines like this: 500 killed, 10,000 arrested, which suggests major protests. But then 24 hours later, headlines revising that count to more than 2,000 dead. And I've even seen one estimate from Iran International's editorial board going as high as 12,000 killed. Which, in any case, are all numbers that might hint at a staggering number of people, reportedly from many towns and cities across the country, out protesting, and who believe Iran's theocracy should end.
It started with the bazaris, with the merchants, but it is included now people of all walks of life. There's students, there's elderly people, there's middle-aged people, there's kids. It's really the whole gamut of Iranian society appears to be involved in these protests.
Now, the regime is still in control, and it has warned those who would chant death to the dictator that they could face the death penalty themselves. But even if Iran makes the protests go away, the US may still see deep vulnerability here because Iran still has the underlying problem that spurred the protests to begin with.
Iran's economy is facing one of its sharpest declines in years.
The country's currency, the rial, has crashed to a record low.
Years of sanctions, isolation, and mismanagement in Iran have crippled its currency. 50 years ago, you could buy a US dollar for about 70 Iranian rials. 50 days ago, it cost you about 900,000 rials for one US dollar. 50 minutes ago, last I checked, you needed somewhere between 1.3 and 1.5 million rials for that same dollar.
That's huge. And so that has impact. Then obviously, pent-up frustration, anger for many, many decades. It brought a lot of people onto the streets that did not protest in past rounds of unrest.
Average annual inflation has hovered stubbornly at around 40%. If you have savings in Iran, they have evaporated in real time. The country's biggest commodities, oil and gas, are restricted on world markets, sanctioned by the US. There are widespread business and government shutdowns for almost every conceivable reason. Water shortages, gas shortages, power outages, too much air pollution, too hot, too cold. By any reasonable standard, these are all signs of an exceptionally vulnerable economy. Again, something which the US may see as exploitable right now. And even all of that is to say nothing of the immense vulnerability of Iran's military leadership itself. When we think about the balance of power in the Middle East, it's important to remember Israel's multi-year war in Gaza was not simply a war on Hamas. It was also a war on Hezbollah in Lebanon and on Houthis in Yemen, all critical proxies through which Iran has historically projected power. But crippling Iran's agents stretched Iran thin as well. So thin, it was unable to prop up its other key regional ally in Syria. The toppling of Bashar al-Assad by rebels in 2024, a loss of one of Iran's most important partners. Then, there were the direct attacks on Iran itself.
Iranian officials now say more than 900 people were killed during Israel's 12-day bombing campaign.
Israel says at least 3 of Iran's top military commanders were killed, and its largest uranium enrichment site was damaged.
The U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the 3 key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime.
The Iranian regime is unprecedentedly weak abroad and at home in this post-October 7th period in the Middle East. So its proxy network across the Middle East is degraded as a result of U.S. military or Israeli military actions. At home, the regime's nuclear program and missile program is rolled back. And then domestically, this is a regime who cannot provide a stable economy, cannot provide consistent electricity, can't even provide enough water for the Iranian people.
So, to repeat the point, there is undeniably a window of opportunity here, a fairly singular chance to destabilize a regime that routinely threatens death to America. But at the same time, let's be clear, Trump is only said to be considering a military strike on Iran. So here's the flip side that explains why the US may see a very different kind of opportunity here. If you've been following this story, you'll know that along with the war footing, there's also a lot of posturing. In the face of US threats, Iran's response was actually twofold. One part defiance, one part willingness to talk. The US in turn seemed to signal it's listening, but weighing its options.
Iran wants to negotiate, yes. We may meet with them. I mean, a meeting is being set up, but we may have to act because of what's happening before the meeting.
Then came more posturing, a pivot or a bluff. Trump would cancel talks while applying even more economic pressure on Iran in the form of tariffs on anyone who would dare trade with it.
What was interesting is that the Iranian regime clearly feels some amount of pressure from those threats and obviously from the protesters, and had tested the waters of diplomacy, which is a classic Iranian play: string out negotiations, try to relieve some pressure on the regime. And this time Trump is saying no.
Now, I won't pretend to know what Trump's strategy is here, but I promise you he will have considered that the option of going to all-out war is not ideal because it's unpredictable. For example, toppling the Iranian regime would lead to what exactly?
Chaos in Iran. Iran is a country of over 90 million people. You could have a situation where you have civil war and upheaval in Iran for years, if not decades. There's a very narrow margin for opposition in Iran. There are different political parties, there are different leaders, but they're within this narrow scope of what's acceptable to the supreme leader, which is quite narrow.
And Trump very likely realizes, to some extent, it's risky to replace the regime with an unknown quantity because the world needs Iran on side. It is, for starters, one of the top oil producers globally, but it also looms over the Strait of Hormuz, which is a critical bottleneck for the flow of oil. Millions of barrels a day travel from oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, out to global markets. An unpredictable or desperate Iran could close the strait altogether, which would affect the supply and therefore the price of oil, just as the Trump administration boasts of success on that front.
We have the Washington Examiner out this morning with gas prices. The national average has fallen to $2.79 per gallon for the first time in nearly 5 years.
And then from the US standpoint, There's a third problem with an Iran that is more chaotic than controlled, and that has everything to do with its missile and nuclear program, which the US believes Iran is now trying to rebuild.
Best case scenario for the United States is that Iran has no nuclear program, frankly, that there's no enrichment, even a civilian nuclear program is off the table.
The US has a long history of trying to keep tabs on Iran's nuclear program. It is one of the most closely watched in the world because of the fear that Iran is trying to weaponize that power, build a bomb.
من تأکید می‌کنم که جمهوری اسلامی هرگز در پی تسلیحات هسته‌ای نیست و نیز هرگز از حق ملت خود در استفاده صلح‌آمیز از انرژی هسته‌ای چشم‌پوشی نخواهد کرد.
And in 2015, world powers signed the so-called Iran nuclear deal, which forced it to dismantle and open to scrutiny much of its nuclear program in exchange for billions of dollars in sanctions relief. Trump, though, pulled the US out of that deal during his first term.
The Iran deal is defective at its core. This was a horrible one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made.
And in the years that followed, the deal effectively collapsed. If Trump hopes to negotiate a new deal, because again, he thinks the old one was so bad.
The setbacks really started when President Obama signed the Iran nuclear deal. This was a disaster for Israel, and it was a disaster for everyone.
Then what he has effectively spent the last 2 weeks doing in threatening to attack Iran is creating leverage for whatever bargain he hopes to strike.
What's in it for the U.S. is this is the moment in which we use and we leverage your constraints and your problems at home to extract that concession that you can't have. You have to give up your nuclear program. We have to have a deal on your ballistic missile capability. That's what's in it for the U.S.
But these are just theories, right? Not even Trump's own inner circle claims to know exactly what he's up to.
What President Trump will do next, only he knows, so the world will have to keep waiting and guessing.
But all the same, here's one more theory. You're going to hear a lot about how Trump's military mission in Venezuela.
The U.S. carried out large-scale strikes on Venezuela overnight.
Captured Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro and his wife.
To face charges of drugs trafficking and narco-terrorism.
How that, in a way, sets the stage, perhaps, for what may happen in Iran. Not because the U.S. may try the same thing. The experts we spoke to all agreed that's not likely.
In this case, I don't think they're going to pluck the supreme leader out. That's just not doable.
Venezuela and Iran could not be more different in terms of the situations and in terms of the military capabilities and the actions that are possible.
Iran's a much bigger country. It's a country that does not have a long history of democracy like Venezuela did before Chavez and Maduro came into power. I think that the regime would be much, much less likely to want to play ball with Trump if Trump took out their leader.
But what is entirely possible is that right now, Trump is riding a wave of his own making. That what he's done in Venezuela automatically confers credibility. It empowers the next threat he makes.
He proved that those are not hollow threats, whether you agree with them or not. And I think he certainly recognizes that and now is trying to leverage that when it comes to President Pezeshkian, to the Supreme Leader, to the broader Iranian leadership throughout their government.
Now, that it also tests the limits of how far Trump can go when exercising power over other countries, that may also be a benefit. But right now, Trump knows his brand of strongman diplomacy relies on three things combined: unpredictability, the projection of power, and most recently, the willingness to actually use it.